There are several different types of membrane transport. Oop, there you go. You can see it now. Simple diffusion, always the simplest one, just stuff spreads out. We talked about with flow down gradients, so stuff moves from a high concentration to areas of low concentration. And in this particular example, there's no barriers, there's no direction, it's just spreading out in all directions. But obviously when we apply it to a cell, we want to look at how particles move across the membrane. And with simple diffusion, it's only those particles that don't see the membrane as a barrier that diffuse that way. Let's take a look. In terms of the context of simple diffusion, or any diffusion for that matter, we really can only use it in our bodies at a pretty small scale, down at the scale of the cell, because it's just so slow. For moving over larger areas or getting things moving faster, then we need to have something like a pumping heart or muscles to cause air to come in and out of our lungs. So this is something that happens at a small scale effectively, at least at the pace of our life. I demonstrated it before in a jar with the flow down gradients, but they were kind of odd results. I'd like to try them again and show them to you here. So here's the jar of water right before I dump in some green dye. You can see it going in. Obviously that's not diffusion, it's just flowing fluid. And here it is at the 1 minute mark with an arrow. And just each minute I took a picture with that arrow as a reference. You can see that it's not spreading out a whole lot. It might be going up a little bit. You can see slight changes from picture to picture. But for the most part, 10 minutes, not a whole lot of change. Now we say that simple diffusion is a passive process. And by that we mean it doesn't take energy. Or more specifically, it doesn't take work. We don't have to expend energy to do it. However, there is energy in the system that's causing all these particles to jostle around, known as Brownian motion. I want to take another look at that here. If you're seeing something on your screen that looks like static, kind of like that snow on a TV, then that's Brownian motion. These particles are just jostling around, and anything that's not a solid, so any sort of fluid, and this is a random motion, so things are spreading out in there, but not in any particular direction. Well, this is all well and good, but what if we put a membrane up here, or some other sort of barrier? Then we start looking at something more like a cell. So let's look at that here on these diagrams. So a cell membrane is not just one thing. It's a lot of stuff, and we call that the fluid mosaic model. The idea that, one, it's fluid. It's not a solid thing around the cell. All these molecules are free to move one direction and another and shift around. But it's also a mosaic. There's a lot of stuff in there. For now, we're going to concentrate on just the phospholipid bilayer, all those red beads with those orange tails. And we're going to ignore things like these glycoproteins and protein channels. So let's just look at it from the standpoint of the phospholipid bilayer. And if we just have that, then even that is selectively permeable. So we can notice that these things get through the membrane, so they can permeate the membrane. But these things over here cannot. It's important that we understand why this is. So why this divide between molecules that can get through and those that cannot. We'll concentrate a lot on the gases, carbon dioxide and molecular oxygen. Both of those are non-polar and they're small. And so they can get through this inner layer because they are essentially fat soluble. A more technical term for that, if you remember, is they are hydrophobic. So anything that's fat soluble, and that includes other hydrophobic molecules like benzene, but also any other lipids like fatty acids or steroids, which include several hormones, can get through. To a somewhat lesser extent, small polar molecules can get through. Now, polar molecules don't get along real well with the fats, right? They're not fat soluble, they're water soluble, especially water because it is water. but it's small enough that some of it can slip through the cracks here as these phospholipids kind of jostle around. So a little bit of water it gets through. Ethanol, even more so. It has some polar bits. You can see this red oxygen over here, but also some non-polar parts. So it pretty easily passes through the membrane. But if it's large and polar, like glucose or really any amino acids, then it can't get through it. It is a barrier, nothing through there. And anything that's charged, which means any of these ions, they're also a no-no. They can't get through. So this gives our membrane this selective quality where some things get through and some things do not. So let's assume that this little hexagon represents oxygen, just molecular oxygen diffusing through the phospholipid bilayer. And here we're looking at a time series. So here's the beginning, time 1, time 2, and time 3. We notice that there's a high concentration of oxygen here and low. So we would predict that oxygen can move through the membrane and will spread out. And that's exactly what we're seeing here at time 2. It's spreading out. And at this point, the motion back and forth is equal. So now we don't have a high and low concentration. We have kind of a medium and a medium concentration. They're equal. And so there's no more net diffusion, even though those molecules do continue to move back and forth. But diffusion is done when everything has spread out. At least that's the way we can treat it. These don't continue to move down here until we end up with a high concentration and low. We would need some sort of active transport for that. Let's look at a couple applications in the body. Obviously, a big one is gas exchange. Oxygen, carbon dioxide exchanging not only in our lungs, but in our cells. Let's take a look at a couple examples here. So here we have pictured an alveolus. This is where that air comes into after all those branchings of the bronchioles, and then the air exits when you exhale. And so we should have a fairly high concentration of oxygen that comes in and a low concentration of carbon dioxide, because that reflects the air that you're breathing. Now, in terms of the blood, because that's where the exchange is taking place, there is a low concentration of oxygen. So look at that. Let's look at that one first. So low concentration of oxygen means that oxygen is diffusing as though these membranes didn't even exist from high to low concentration into these blood cells that are waiting to pick them up. Simple enough. And it's going to continue to do that, diffusing into the blood as long as there's contact here until the concentrations essentially even out and the blood leaving the lungs is essentially a medium oxygen concentration. Right? It can't be as high as the air coming in because that's not how diffusion works. We just get it to be an even amount. So the reverse is essentially true of carbon dioxide. We have a high concentration of carbon dioxide for the blood coming in, and we said this was a low concentration here, and so carbon dioxide keeps diffusing out of these blood cells into the air spaces until again they're even and these blood cells have gotten rid of a lot of their carbon dioxide. So that blood will leave the lungs, go to the heart, and be distributed around the body. And until it gets diffused, there should be a relatively high concentration of oxygen and a low concentration of carbon dioxide that remains in the bloodstream until it gets to the cells. And there's lots and lots of cells, and these blood vessels branch, and that exchange takes place at the capillaries. But here's our cell. And inside the cell, let's consider what's the concentration of oxygen and what's the concentration of carbon dioxide. So do you think the concentration of oxygen would be low or high within the cells? Well, it should be relatively low inside the cells because the cells are using them up. And so oxygen tends to diffuse into the cells just by simple diffusion, ignoring those membranes. And even though oxygen diffuses in, the cell uses it up, and so more diffuses in, and this blood flows along, and new oxygen-rich blood comes in, and so oxygen keeps flowing in. The reverse is true for carbon dioxide. As the cell uses oxygen, it's producing energy, breaking down sugars into carbon dioxide, so those levels stay fairly high and diffuse out into the low concentration of CO2 in the bloodstream. Again, blood flows down, fresh blood comes in, more carbon dioxide is produced inside the cell, and more diffusion out. So there's this essentially constant exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. The other thing that I want to emphasize here is the size of the cell. What if this cell were not little, but were quite a bit larger? And then you had CO2 being produced on this end of the cell and a mitochondria over here that needs oxygen, but it has to travel this long distance. So CO2 has to travel all the way across the cell, keeps going, and then finally gets into the bloodstream. And same with oxygen, that it has to diffuse all the way across the cell to the mitochondria to get used. Well, that would take forever. That would really, really slow down the processes inside the cell. So by keeping these cells fairly small, then diffusion can still take place and support the activities within the cell without really slowing life down. One other application of simple diffusion is hormones, but not all hormones, just the steroid hormones. And most of the sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, these are all steroid hormones. There's a couple others as well, but I'll just focus on these guys. And so they're testosterone patches as well as birth control patches, all containing these steroid hormones. They can diffuse through the skin, essentially just ignoring those cell membrane layers, into the body. And the larger the patch, the larger the area, and the more diffusion takes place. But this provides kind of this slow diffusion of hormones into the body over time, increasing our overall levels of these hormones. And these hormones can go anywhere they want in the body. The membranes are not a barrier to them at all. And so they typically, when they go into a cell, will target the nucleus because they just pass right on through, get into the nucleus, and cause some changes in there. And we know how powerful steroid hormones can be on the activity of the body. Well, that simple diffusion is simple, right? Things just spread out. But in the case of cells where there's a membrane here, then it really only applies to things like lipids and gases, other nonpolar molecules that can slip in and out. Other substances are going to be a little more complicated and need different types of membrane transport. If you have any questions, post them in the comments, or I'd be curious to know if you can think of other examples in the body where simple diffusion really applies, or you think it might. Well, that's it for this time. Until next time, keep being fascinated by life, even the little simple things.